Right, hello everyone. Today's session we're going to talk about the expert-lay divide. Now as we go through the slides and I'm talking to you about this divide, I want you to keep in the back of your mind or keep questioning what is the ideology or beliefs behind what I'm saying, and also within your workplaces and the communities you deal with in terms of how they view the world. What are their beliefs and ideas? Also, try to think about it in ways of having different epistemologies. How do we know things? And the ontology in terms of our ways of being. How is it that we operate in the world? All of these things intersect and create the amazing complexity with which we deal every single day. Now, in terms of knowledge, it has different expressions. It can be considered to be rational technical knowledge that emerges from a scientific approach to collecting evidence or data. It can be opinion, it can be analysis. So we really have to try to understand the differences between these when we're working with people, and also in our own work and the types of information that we produce for others. This also means that we need to be reflexive practitioners. What that means is that we reflect on our own work and the impacts that we have on others, and how we are as professionals, and what it means to be a professional when carrying out the responsibilities that we do have and under the delegated authorities that we might have. And within this, we also need to link these sorts of, conceptual ideas with practice in terms of how it is that we do planning, engineering, archaeology, community development, all these sorts of careers. So in this sense, when we're thinking about this, we need to understand that there's this notion of synoptic planning. So we have a complete overview of information by which we make decisions. It's often related to a techno-rational approach to decision-making, how we obtain data. So we can think about it in a very sort of logical, scientific mode by which we collect information and apply it to problems. We also have to think about this with regards to how this information is used in policy development and its implementation, whether we create incremental change within our workplaces, within society, either the policies or programs that we have, or whether we just do broad scale change that's quite substantially different. When we're working with people and we're trying to encourage their participation in processes and to give them more power over things that affect their lives, we then start to move into communicative planning, and that's associated with different modes and methods of working with people. And also, we have to consider as well where our different systems fall into different ways of having power and influence. So in this sense, corporatist. So if you look at planning per se, or other political spheres like federal government or state government, there is a tendency currently toward corporatist planning, where you have large industry bodies or other lobby groups with a lot of money and power who tend to have greater access to the levers of decision making than do the general public. All of these things do play out in our working lives. So let's just go very quickly through what is knowledge. So I already noted that epistemology is about studying the nature of knowledge. There is an article that I've put up on the LMS by law, and it talks about knowledge in a very different way than perhaps we're used to. So although we often see knowledge as being possessed or defined as a skill, law looks at knowledge as being a network. It's a product of a network of heterogeneous materials. That means it doesn't necessarily mean that knowledge is only within our minds as human beings. Knowledge can be embedded within our physical environments. Most of our environments, the materials that we use in our environments, are designed so they contain embedded knowledge. A pen, a table, bridges, all of these things are actors in their own right for knowing the world, and within that having an influence on our world and on ourselves. And within that you find the previous knowledge of other developments become part of those physical type structures. So it's an interesting concept to think that there are knowledge producers and actors within the production of knowledge that are non-human. If we look at knowledge in terms of it being a product of science or scientific inquiry, it's a belief that's not accidentally true. What that means is that different variables or factors are studied in a very systematic way with careful observation, recording of that observation, and an analysis. So it creates a representation of what we believe to be true. In this way, science is only one type of representation of reality. It's one that in a secular society we tend to use as the basis of our decision making. However, there are other forms of knowledge that we also have to be cognizant and respectful of, and we will address that in a little bit later. What you have up here, and this is just in general for when you're thinking about knowledge, but also and thinking about the scientific method and how you do your work, but it also has applications if you're involved in research in any way, is a whole brief history of how it is that we've come to see knowledge within a scientific type context. So what you see here are the early philosophers where they were really trying to think through notions of induction and deduction through reason and reason and logic. What it is when you think about induction, it's about looking at what's already there, and we're trying to develop our theories from our empirical observations. Whereas deductive logic is where we have a theory or an idea, and based on that, we then look to see whether empirical observations support or don't support our, our existing theories about what should exist or shouldn't exist, or how things happen or should happen. So you have different examples like Aristotle and Plato. When you start to get into a much more systematic empirical analysis where you're doing the recording and you're testing different variables and influences on variables, you start to get into a more mechanistic and positivist approach to research and logic and thinking. So in which case these sorts of approaches are associated with classification, falsification, taxonomy, cause and effect. We often think of this as more statistical, quantitative methods. So we can thank Bacon, Descartes, Locke, Newton, and Linnaeus for these approaches to how we know the world. In the 1960s and 70s, based on this sort of techno-rational approach to the world, these types of ways of collecting data and producing our representation of the world very heavily influenced how we did planning, engineering, and the solutions that we found to particular problems. Was, I guess, challenged by more of a critical approach, or what we'd call a postmodern approach as well. And what it was the realization that there are a lot of underlying assumptions in terms of how we approached the scientific method, how we approached collecting data that was not representative of all populations. So often the experiences of women, people of color, lower socioeconomic classes, people with disabilities, weren't actually part of our processes of framing problems, identifying what issues were, whose needs were being met in our societies, and the way that we researched it. So these sorts of notions of having a critical approach, you might look at particular policies or research or people through, let's say, a feminist lens where you're trying to understand what does this mean for equality. You might look at it from a racialized perspective, which is trying to understand how different people from different ethnicities and different backgrounds respond in the world. These things were really quite confrontational to the old school way of doing things. And in a postmodern perspective, it is the acknowledgement that there's multiple perspectives, there's multiple truths in how we view and experience the world. So these often come out in terms of different explanations of how we approach our research. So using a lot of the empiricism, which is knowledge based on direct experience, that's often connected with what we'd call realism. And this notion of realism is that there is an objective truth out there, you know, we can think through it, and we can have a rational sort of approach to how we understand what is physically available for us to assess. Phenomenology or phenomenalism is very much about our experiential approaches. How do we feel and experience the world? And what are the knowledges that come out of those types of engagements? Instrumentalism, that often aligns more with a utilitarian perspective. That is, we're out to solve a problem, we're collecting data and approaching, I guess, our research or our policy development or different activities in a particular way. We want to find an intervention, so therefore we then look to certain data or information in particular ways. Often this is associated with our notions of the rational actor paradigm and the techno-rational approaches to doing things, and that is, with all the given information, we can make logical decisions, and so will our populations with whom we're dealing. This instrumentalism or utilitarianism is often also associated with our notions of the public good and the public interest, in that we assume that we often need to maximize the greatest benefit for the greatest number of people. Now, that's not always true, because in order to function as a society, we often have to deal with particular populations in different ways in order to make sure that they're engaged. And that's where the postmodern perspective comes in, and also how we might do our research, which, if you look at it from a approach of constructivism, it's about taking in political influences, socioeconomic influences, gender influences, sexuality, those sorts of things. So although this is very brief, hopefully it gives you a bit of an idea about how we might understand the world, the sort of ideologies or thinking behind those sorts of things, and how you yourself might fall in different categories, which affects how you relate to other people. So how do we know what we know? If we want to look at other ways of understanding knowledge, we have the philosophical. So in many ways, what I've presented before are the philosophical approaches. They're the conceptual notions for how we might interact. They're associated with the theoretical. So it's idea about how the world actually operates. But we also have within this moral knowledge. So what's taste or preference, and how does that relate to truth? We often find that in debates where people bring in their personal ethics, there might be religious understandings of the world that form a different type of knowledge. And that can often be very different from the empirical, which is what's observed. Experiential, as I told you about, which is very much about the phenomenological perspective, and then we have the technical, the knowing how to do things. What we work with as professionals a lot, especially if we're engaged with communities to learn what they know about their world, is tacit knowledge. We might ask a question or ask people to participate. They might think that they have nothing to offer, but when we ask them, when we start engaging with them and they're talking about their particular world, their particular neighborhood and what they know, we often elicit a lot of information about their behaviors, their patterns, how they envision their cities. And that's tacit knowledge, because they don't even know what they have to offer that might be relevant. And we're often in those powerful positions of actually deciding what is relevant and what's not. We also have conventional wisdom. Basically, this is the common knowledge that may or may not be true, but we, as a society or as groups of people, assume or take to be true. So knowledge is actually produced. It's not inherent. We just don't have knowledge. We have to put ideas together. We have to test them. So the way that we do this is by working. So when we're talking about knowledge, what we have to also consider is that there's bias in knowledge production, right? So all of us are professionals. We produce knowledge. When we work with communities, when we ask our colleagues questions, and then we start to produce steps on how to do things, policies, or we want to influence other people at meetings, we are producing knowledge, and we jointly do so through a social process. But we do have our biases, and those can be the moral, political, or social, and our cultural, economic experiences that feed into how we view the world and how we think things should be. But it's also about what sort of research questions we choose to ask, or often if we're lower in a hierarchy, what the political questions that governments might want asked, they filter down, and it directs how we pay attention to different data and choose to collect that data. In addition, we might have bias through the cost and time of data collection. We often don't have enough money or to do full outreach. So we often end up with what we might consider convenient samples. People who already have an interest, want to be interested, people who have transport to get to sites to participate in different ways or have access to internet. When we want to work with I guess, disadvantaged communities where there's a lot more time and effort required, we might include far fewer voices of those groups of people because we don't necessarily have the knowledge, skills, or other resources to do it appropriately. Within this as well, there's always a question over the legitimacy of data sources and types. Where are we getting our information? Who's giving it to us? Who are they funded by? These become really important questions because especially in dealing with planning, engineering, archaeology, community development projects, because you often find that they're either the lobby groups or the bias behind research questions, as I said before, are coming from particular political or social or moral or cultural perspectives. And so we find arguments around us all the time where instead of competing or debating the ideas themselves, we actually start criticizing the person and their attributes. A good example right now, and why this becomes very, very important, is Emma Alberici from the ABC did an article talking about the government's inclination to reduce corporate tax cuts, and she's basically denouncing it. Now, many other people had also denounced it before. However, she was severely attacked by the government and particular business groups. Now, if you actually look at all the articles about this and the different discussions, you find that although it was claimed that she did very poor research, no one's been actually able to identify what is factually incorrect. Instead, she has been criticized for only having an arts degree, not knowing anything about economics, and therefore not being someone who can talk on this issue. The reality is she actually does have an economics degree, has been a very respected reporter in this area, and so in which case, these sorts of criticisms have not been able to gain as much ground as their proponents would have liked. We find instances of this all the time when we have these debates in planning, in heritage issues and these sorts of things. So legitimacy really comes into it in terms of data source and type. Who's producing this data? Are they influenced in any way by different money, different bodies? What are they trying to achieve? Do they have the credentials to produce this information? How do we assess that? All of these things get played out. So especially with researchers or with experts, one of the things when people don't like ideas, even if the data or evidence points to that idea or that expression of that idea being correct, the first thing to be attacked is the legitimacy, the credential. So that becomes a really important aspect of how we do things and why we need to be aware of our methods of data collection and also the limits of the scope of our knowledge. And that flows into how data is applied, interpreted, and analyzed. Within this as well, we also have problems with statistics itself, the difference between individual variance and averages. So when you have a lot of data points, let's say you're dealing with a large population, there is a lot of diversity. However, when we're talking about averages, it flattens it out, and it may not fully represent what what the truth is, so to speak. So if you look at incomes with a very strongly polarized society, an average income might seem quite reasonable. However, if we look at the median, which is who's below a 50% mark, we might find that that shifts significantly, and that our understanding of a population's economics suddenly shifts and points to problems that we may not have seen using a different type of data presentation or manipulation. So this also follows through into our representation and into our language. When we want to look at the expert-lay divide as a dichotomy, we tend to say, okay, experts are systematic, the public is not systematic. Experts are very technical, the general population is ad hoc. Experts are really rational and they think through things, whereas the community has bias and they're emotional. Experts have specialty training, the public doesn't, and then you have communities of knowledge versus knowledge sources from the community that might come from anywhere. Now, this dichotomy might be very easy to help us understand different, I guess, expectations or stereotyping of situations and people, or our own biases in terms of when we enter into engagements with the public. But the fact is, it's never this clear cut, because when we as professionals deal with the public, they often have a variety of experiences that might be similar to ours. You might have people who were experts in their field, but now they're retired. And also, when you're dealing with urban issues, you might have people who don't have formal education, but their powers of observation and their community networks means that they're incredibly knowledgeable about things that we can't even imagine. So I want you to just think for a moment. This is just an example of what's been happening recently in the news, and this is about Trump and his decision that the high school shootings in the US would be partially solved if teachers were given guns in the classroom and a bonus, and they were trained yearly. In Australia, most Australians find this really quite absurd. We had a devastating mass shooting. Laws became very, very strict. There were gun buybacks, and ideologically, our views were, let's take guns off the street, let's make them difficult for people to get hold of, that army assault rifles do not belong in the general population. So that goes back to our notion of ideology. Our knowledge, when we look back and ask ourselves, was that a good policy? If you look at the statistics from gun deaths, comparing the United States, where over the same time regulation got weaker and weaker compared to Australia, you could look back and look at that evidence and say, okay, well, yes, these policies were a good idea. In terms of the experiential aspect of it, if anyone's traveled to the United States, then they start to see how we view safety and is quite different culturally, socially, and culturally to the United States. So how we act, our notions of neighborly trust and all of that are significantly different. And so that fits into our ontology, our relationship with risk, and how much anxiety that we might feel. So when you put this all together, you start to see how different knowledges come through. The other interesting thing is the association in the United States often with gun ownership and Christianity, which forms in many ways a very unlikely relationship between those things. But then there's that moral knowledge in terms of the right to defend ourselves against our government, but also because if God wants to protect us, and if they're part of our lives, they will help us do the right thing with these weapons that we have. So the reason why I bring this up is because it's such an extreme example compared to what we're used to in Australian society, although it's quite normalized there. But it allows us to start to reflect and highlight many of the issues that I brought up earlier, which is, how do you identify legitimacy, evidence, knowledge? Where do you sit? What do you believe in? And what are the different types of interactions that we might have? So I'll end this session here, and the next video will be about professionalism.